All right. So we're gonna get started. People will keep coming in as we go along. So welcome everyone. This is the klogW series special holiday edition. I tried to make this slide a bit more festive. Shuba is going to introduce our speaker. I just want to say some general things about our series. It has been some time since we had our last talk, but we are relaunching, and we're excited that we have a few speakers coming up. So we're starting our APS Fellow series. These are the people in our community that were nominated by GSNP and were elected to be APS Fellows. So today we have Santo Fortunato, who's gonna speak in a moment, but we also have coming up Jacinda Conrad and Srikant Sastry coming up. We will send announcements about those. Also, you can see our past events on our website, and there are recordings from most of them. We're trying to transition into a YouTube channel format because we can't have all the videos on our website. But this should be, so there are a couple missing, the more recent ones, but they should be there soon. So we will figure it out. If you would like to see a recording of the talk and sooner, then it's up there. Just send me or Shuba an email. Okay, so with this, I want to advertise GSNP, our community that is behind this klogW series, which is part of the American Physical Society. So we're the group on statistical and nonlinear physics, which covers a lot of super exciting and diverse topics. And if you are in the talk today as a participant, it means that some aspects of your work, your interests lie within statistical and nonlinear physics. So please join. It is, I believe it's very cheap for students and postdocs. It's not very expensive for faculty either. So please join. And this is the website. If you have questions for how to join, feel free to email us. So yeah, that's the link. Additionally, I wanted to say that in GSNP, in this group, we are looking for new people. And if you are here today in this Zoom room, we do want to ask you, like, what would you like to see this community do more of? Do you have any ideas? Would you like to get involved? We really encourage people of all backgrounds and ages and stages in their career. Of course, I do encourage young people to come because maybe they have a bit more of a hesitation to get involved, but it can be even more important for them to do get involved. But we do want fresh ideas, but I don't want to discriminate against anybody. We want all at all stages, people who are excited to do things and to suggest new things for GSNP. So if you do want to get involved, feel free to email Tim. Tim is a very friendly person, so he is, so it's, yeah, just email him. You can CC me, you can email me as well, but Tim is gonna be more involved with this aspect. Okay, so this was all the advertising. The next thing I want to talk about very briefly is our Zoom etiquette. So during the talk, please make sure you're on mute. If you just joined, make sure you're on mute. Feel free to post questions in the chat box. If there are, during the talk, if there are clarification questions, Shuba or I will interrupt the speaker and who has agreed to this, and we will ask the questions. But otherwise, most general questions will be saved for the end. After the talk, you can raise your hand and we will sort of address you, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly so that it's more of a direct discussion, like in a live real seminar. If you have issues with the mic or you're shy, you can put the question in the chat box and we will ask it for you. Okay, so with this, I will stop sharing, and Shuba, I think you're gonna do a brief introduction.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So we are delighted to have the first of our APS-GSNP fellows, new fellows, Santo Fortunato. Santo is a professor at the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering at Indiana University. He's also the director of the Indiana University Network Science Institute and has been so since 2018. Santo, you'll be surprised to know, got his PhD in theoretical high energy physics at the University of Bielefeld in Germany, and working on percolation and deconfinement in SU2 gauge theory is the title of his thesis.
That's right.
But then he, at Bielefeld itself, he got interested in percolation theory and then in complex networks. So he did a postdoc at the School of Informatics at Indiana University with Alessandro Vespignani, and then went on to be a research scientist at the Complex Networks Lagrange Laboratory of the Institute for Scientific Exchange in Torino, and has then a professorship at Aalto University in Finland, and now back in Indiana, where he has been since 2016. So with this varied experience, we are delighted to have Santo tell us a little bit about network science. So please go ahead, Santo.
Thanks, Shubha and Daphne. This is thanks for the invitation. Yeah, it looks a bit strange that I did this kind of strange path, but at the end, I was doing statistical QCD, so some heavy knowledge of phase transition critical phenomena was critical, to be productive in the subject. And it is also critical to work in network science from a physics perspective, even though now I'm kind of more reaching out towards computer science, artificial intelligence, and so on. I would say a couple of things about AI just at the end, because I think this is a very fruitful thing for a lot of physicists to work on. That said, let me then share the screen and see if we can get this going. Again, please feel free asking questions during the process. Putting it in the chat as indicated, and be happy to address them on the fly. So, I usually talk to people who know about networks, but in general, I can assume that this is the case here, and this is actually one of the reasons why I'm happy to do this. So, network or graph, I may use both words with the same meaning here. Been around for a long time, and they offer a powerful representation of many different systems in different domains, from biology, so social sciences, to infrastructure, so technological domains, internet, the web, and other things, communication. We'll give some examples next. And there are two key ingredients to build a network. So there are the dots that you may see in some of the diagrams I'm going to show you, which are called nodes or vertices. And these are going to be the fundamental units of your system, whether it's, people in a social network, or proteins in a protein-protein interactor network, or papers in a scientific citation network, or authors even collaborating in a collaboration network. So this would be the fundamental entity of the system that you're studying. And the relation between pairs of these units is represented by an edge. So if there is an interaction of any kind, friendship or interaction between proteins or citation between papers, we're going to see examples next. So to frame a bit more context, including this picture you see in my back here, but let me start with the first top left here. It's a social network of Facebook users, and users are students of Northwestern University here in the US. You see a lot of dots. Maybe you don't see so easy the lines, the edges here. This is, of course, this kind of dense network. There's a lot of connections between the nodes. In this case, there is an edge between two nodes if the two corresponding Facebook users are Facebook friends to each other. As you know, this is a mutual relationship. I don't know if you know it, because modern generation, I'm not really familiar with Facebook anymore. I'm still a good Facebook user. From Facebook to Twitter, so the first one was a social network, so in which the interaction is really social, interaction exchanges between people. And the second one is more about information, because it has, of course, still to do with people, but what you see in the middle here with the two different colors is a network of Twitter users, and there is an edge, directed edge, from user A to user B. If B retweets a post of or tweet of user A. So in this case, there is a direction, and direction also indicates the flow of information, in this case from A to B, because B retweets what A is doing. So in a sense that information passes from A to B. And these networks like this have been used to study the flow of information, specifically the flow of misinformation that occurs on Twitter, which has been decisive in many different things, recent examples about elections and also COVID-19. In this case, the tweets are about politics, specifically about the midterm 2010 election here in the US, and the color indicates the different political leanings of the Twitter users, with blue, of course, being more liberal, progressive, and red, conservative accounts. So as you can see, the interaction are most strongly, the strongest within homogeneous users with same political leanings, and with more sparse between these different blocks. And this is one of the reasons why you see the creation of the so-called echo chambers in this media, not only on Twitter. The fact that people somehow talk to each other if they're similar to each other, and in so doing, they reinforce each other's beliefs, even when these beliefs are, let's say, debatable. So this is why you use networks like this to study this process of information and misinformation diffusion on networks. And this is the internet instead. Top right here. And in this case, the nodes are the routers that really just redirect your signal from one side to the other of the internet. And two routers changing signals then are connected by an edge. There are many maps of the internet that are constantly updated. Bottom left, you have instead a transportation network in which the nodes are airports in the US here. And you have two different maps, one else in the inset, looks a bit weird. The bigger one instead is more faithful to the geographic distribution of the airports. And you see some of the dots are larger than others because they have more connections between two airports are set if there are direct flights connecting the two airports. And then you have an example from biology here. In fact, two, ecology, part of biology, sense. The one in the middle is an example, it's a protein-protein interaction network, in which then there are proteins which physically bind with each other when they express their function in the cell. And as also in this case, you see some of the dots are larger than others, indicating that they have more interaction partners. And finally, another example here from ecological networks, this is a predator-prey food web in the Everglades in Florida. And in this case, there is a direct connection between two dots if if one species preys on the other one. Dots are species. And the larger ones are usually the ones who are more dominant in this chain, but it can also be preyed upon by other species, superior species. So you can expect that on the left here, these larger blue dots represent things like alligators, the biggest species in the Everglades, and the smaller ones instead, the weaker species, which are both predators and prey.
Santo, quick question.
Yes.
How do you decide to, the transportation network made me think of this. How do you decide to lay out these nodes in a situation where geography or, there's no underlying structure? For example, the internet nodes or the ecological.
Oh, there are many different, there are many different layouts. Usually, one of the most famous ones, which they can get from physics, is the force-directed layout, in which basically you assume that the nodes are like point masses, and depending on how many the ones which have the highest number of connections are usually placed in the middle, and then kind of they repel the other nodes until basically the system equilibrates. So basically introduce forces between two nodes based on on how many neighbors they have, in common, and that somehow creates this force that then eventually has to be equilibrated to get this layout. This is one way to do it. Actually, it's true because networks are usually infinite dimensional systems, except in this case, in this exceptional case of transportation network, in which you also have geographic dimension, and it makes sense somehow to represent them also, in space, to also add this dimension. But usually, of course, when you study it as a network, you don't really care about this. You just care about relationship between pairs of nodes. So you tend to neglect that. But you can use it, for instance, in the case of the airport network, you can use also the geography to make sense of some of the results you can find, specifically in the case of looking for clusters or communities, which is what is the main topic of today's talk. Yeah, I hope that. So there are different ways to lay out a network. In this thing, like the physical layout, in which basically you have these forces between nodes based on how many, neighbors they have in common, that basically turns into a mechanical problem of finding the equilibrium point of these interacting masses. Now, if there's nothing else, I can then introduce basically the problem. The networks that you see and many others are, among the other things, have a characteristic property, which is the fact that they are modular. They have so-called community structure, like in this example on the right that you see, this is of course very stylized, where modular structure, community structure, means basically they are divided in groups. They contain some groups which are strongly attached to each other, whose nodes are strongly attached to each other, and only sparsely connected to the nodes of different groups. So also in this case, you see the three colors would indicate the three communities or modules or clusters. I may use the three words with the same meaning in the talk, and you can tell that there are comparatively more links between the blue nodes, between the red nodes, between the yellow nodes than there are between nodes of different colors. And in these cases are highlighted with green lines here. This is, of course, a very high-level description that can be formalized in many different ways, which is why this is a highly ill-defined problem, like all unsupervised classification and supervised learning problems. This is actually part of its success and also its curse, because basically means that it's also difficult to validate, and validation has been one of the things I've been most active on, despite the fact, like I said, it is an ill-defined problem, so there is not really an objective which is shared in the community, but I'm going to address this specifically later. So thinking about some of the systems you've seen before, you may wonder what these communities represent. And in a social network, they usually represent people with common interests, and therefore they hang out, they have more interactions with each other, like you've seen before in the case of the Twitter network, the way, conservative accounts are much more likely to interact with each other than with liberal accounts, and vice versa. There could be scholars working on the same field. If we're looking at a network of collaboration between authors in which people are connected if they have at least one paper together. In this case, obviously, if people... somebody is saying something?
No, I think you should go on.
Okay, right. Yeah, like I said, you can stop me at any time. In this collaboration network, of course, then you expect that people working often with each other, they work on the same field, and therefore somehow the classes now kind of more or less match the fields, which is also actually one way to do backtracking and discover the field this way, identifying somehow the boundaries between fields from the network collaboration between authors. In a protein-protein interaction network, which you see an example before, that were for yeast, then proteins with equal similar function are supposed to interact more strongly with each other than with proteins. Different function, in this case, modules would represent somehow almost one-to-one the functions of the proteins. And in a citation network, papers cite each other more often than not because they are in the same topic and so on. So this is where they come from. The question could be that why would we need to break a system into pieces to do this exercise called community detection or graph clustering, community discovery, network clustering. People that call it different communities, they call it in different ways, but the problem is the same. And there are three main reasons why people are so interested in that. This is probably the single most explored analysis tool within network science, and it's still very active today. One reason is to discover the organization of the network, right? It's more or less like identifying the organs of the human body, where the brain, the liver, the lungs, all these pieces, key pieces of that have specific function in the network are. Another reason is to be able to classify nodes based on their role within the groups. Once I know the partition, of a network into clusters or communities, then, for instance, I can assign a role to nodes based on whether, for instance, like in this case, in the red circles, the nodes are entirely embedded in their groups. They don't share any connection with nodes of different colors, or if they instead have interactions also with nodes of different groups. And these ones identified by, in this case, the yellow circles here represent the so-called gatekeepers. These are the nodes that you would like to keep an eye on to contrast dangerous spreading phenomena, whether it's misinformation or viral spreading. These are the people who want to isolate or vaccinate or contain in order to avoid that the bad thing, it could be virus or misinformation, reaches out to farther away portions of the network. And this is connected to the other point here. So once you have this thing, once you have this modular division ready, then you can also use it somehow to see what kind of effect it has on dynamics, and use it then as a basis for interventions like the ones I mentioned earlier. So these are the main reasons why people are interested in that, pretty much in all disciplines. Most people, of course, are just users. They just want to push a button, get the groups, and then try to make sense of what they find. There are conclusions or established protocols to decide what to do with this, and based, of course, on what the object of the investigation is. So this is the problem. It is a difficult problem, also from a computational point of view. To give you a sense of that, I'm going to show you here on the bottom left the adjacency matrix of this network. The adjacency matrix represents pretty much the connection between all the nodes of the network. In this case, I used ones to indicate that nodes with the corresponding labels are connected. For instance, this one here, I hope you can see the arrow, indicates the nodes 1 and node 2, even though I didn't put labels here. We're talking about this network above here. So it has 15 nodes, 15 by 15 matrix. And it just tells you, for instance, in this case, 1 and 2 are connected, and 9 and 1 are connected because there is a 1 here. The matrix is symmetric with respect to the diagonal, because the links are undirected. So they go from A to B and from B to A. So if you have AB, you also have BA. And empty space instead indicates the lack of connections between the corresponding nodes. So for instance, in this case, 3 and 1 are not connected. There's empty space here, 4 and 1, and so on. If I had put zeros, you may have had some problems to localize the ones, because most networks of interest are actually sparse. You don't have many ones in these matrices. You have an overwhelming majority of zeros and then just a few ones. So if you take a look at this matrix here, which will represent, which somehow condense all the structural information that you see visualized in the figure above, you wouldn't have a feeling that there is a modular structure here. I mean, that would be indicated if you see that there are groups of nodes which are strongly interacting. There are a lot of ones between those groups of nodes. It doesn't seem to be the case here, but only because I represented it. I mean, I put somehow the vertex labels in a specific order. If I change the order, as you see here, scramble these labels, and I put first the ones corresponding to the red nodes, and then the ones corresponding to the blue nodes, and then the ones corresponding to the yellow nodes, you see indeed how many that the ones basically concentrate in these groups, and only the green ones corresponding to these green lines that you see here indicates the connections between different groups. So if you take a look at a matrix like this, then you see indeed there is a community structure. There are 3 clearly defined blocks, and this would be somehow the solution of my problem. So pretty much doing community detection means doing operating, of course, not directly. Very few people do this directly. You know, I'm going to tell you what people do instead. Doing this kind of transformation, try to go from this situation, which could be perhaps the one that you are facing when they hand you the data set, to a situation like this in which the structure becomes discoverable. And of course, this is fairly easy to do it for a system of this size, only 15 nodes. It's not that easy to do it if you're looking at system with millions of nodes and billions of edges. Then, of course, would be like, for instance, 1 million by 1 million matrix with pretty much almost always 0 and very few ones that you have to rearrange somehow this way. So it's an ill-defined problem because there is no universally shared definition of what community is. Sometimes it depends on the application. And likewise, even if at some point you say, okay, this is a community, it's hard to tell how good the community is because not all communities are equally good, are equally pronounced or strong. And also this is an ill-defined concept. So that's the reason, like I say, it's success and also it's course success because everybody feels entitled to propose a new definition of community, a new method to find it. Curse because we don't, I mean, not always it's easy to understand whether new proposals are really introducing any progress, meaningful progress in the field, or rather contributing to the increase of the noise, which is why I'm so interested in the issue of validation. So what I'm going to tell you today is pretty much three things. The first thing, I'm going to introduce you to the main way that people still today are using, adopting to identify the clusters, communities in a network, which is optimization of a so-called quality or benefit function, and specifically modularity optimization. The second thing is validation, how to test algorithm for community detection, how we can tell if algorithm A is better than algorithm B, if we can at all, because like I said, the problem is ill-defined. And finally, and this is really more like the last frontier, I would tell you something that lies at the interface between artificial intelligence, specifically machine learning, deep learning, and network science, where in my opinion, the main breakthroughs or the main advances of the next 5 to 10 years will sit for our community. But it also means that we have to learn a lot, about these things. I mean, machine learning is not part of my background. Like I said, I come from high energy particle theory. So basically what I'm going to show you is that using a portion of this thing called graph embedding or graph representation learning, and see how that can be used to find the clusters in an alternative way with respect to this other thing that I'm going to tell you next. So before I get into this, like I said, this is it's more a lecture than a seminar, really. I'm going to tell you something which is very general aside from my own contribution, and then try to plant a few seeds there of things that I've done. And of course, this was a long process, long many years, and involving many people at different stages, and some people more involved than others, and I would like to thank them all. So the first part then is about how to do this detection, how to find these clusters. Like I said, the most popular class of methods consists in optimizing a function. So you have basically a function that gives you a score for each partition, just like you give a score to a student, and the winner is the partition with the largest score, or with a smaller score, depending. Sometimes you have to maximize it, depends on what the specific measure is. Sometimes you have to minimize it. In our case, we're going to go for maximization because the function that I'm going to introduce, which is the most famous function, by the way, the gold standard, this field, reaches high values when the partitions into communities. They have to be maximized. A general problem with this class of approaches, regardless of the specific function you're using, is the fact that the answer depends on the whole network structure, meaning that it can change if you eventually work on a different version of the same data. For instance, suppose that this is my data set. I mean, very stylized, it's just a gray ball with assuming that you have to assume that there are nodes connected by edges there. And that I apply this method, I find the 3 clusters. If it turns out, or I already knew, that this gray ball is a subset, is a piece of a larger network, which is indicated by the lighter gray ball, and I rerun my method on the bigger ball, which includes also the original system I studied, then I'm going to get usually different communities in the subset that I analyzed previously, even if the function is the same. So it has this kind of feature that since it uses information at a global scale, and therefore the answer really depends on whether you're focusing on the system as a whole or on a part of it. So this is something I never really liked, and it's more, if you want, conceptual. And I'm going to tell you something more specific instead about other problems. But this is common to all measures, whereas the problem that I'm going to emphasize somehow is more specific for this measure. So one of the things I hope you will remember after this is this measure, which unfortunately was not introduced by me, but by the great Mark Newman, who is also an APS fellow, as you see, it's almost 20 years old, but it's still kind of dominating the field. It has good things and bad things, and I'm gonna say something about both. So just to give an idea, I mean, the very high level, how important the thing is, you can match this within network science to this equation in physics. And in fact, there are some elements in common. There is an M, there is a C, there is a square. Of course, that's a joke, but just to give you an idea, and this is why I'm insisting so much. I worked so much on this measure after, almost right after it was introduced, and so many people are still proposing different ways to optimize this. So let me tell you what this thing is, how you can compute it, where it comes from, and how people optimizes it. The goal is, of course, finding the maximum of this score over all possible network divisions or partitions. And like all most interesting optimization problem, it is an NP-complete problem, which means that there are people actually working on exact optimization, but these things not really go beyond networks with a few hundreds, a couple of thousand nodes. There are actually recent progress in this direction. But as you can imagine, it's a very complex landscape of solutions. So to be able to probe it effectively and make sure that you land on the absolute maximum is really, very steep process. And people are just content them, with an approximation of the maximum, even sometimes without guarantees, without knowing how far it is from the actual objective. So let me tell you what the thing is first, how to read this formula. It's indicated with the letter Q. M is the total number of edges or links in the network. This is actually what represents somehow the global scale I'm going to tell you about, not just because it's present here before the summation, because that's just a factor, doesn't change anything, certainly doesn't change the position of the maximum, but mostly because it enters somehow within this key pieces of the measure. NC is the number of communities, so how many blocks you have, how many communities you have in the whole network. So this is a sum over the clusters, sum over the communities, and for each community, C, you compute this difference. The first term of this difference is the number of links within community C. So the number of pairs of nodes of C which are connected to each other. So only within that. In the case before, for instance, the number of links connecting blue to blue, or red to red, or yellow to yellow. Whereas the second term here that I'm going to tell you, in the second term, there is again M, which is the total number of edges or links of the network. And this C is the total degree of the nodes in community C. So the degree of a node is the number of its neighbors, the number of nodes it is connected to. So this C would be the sum of the number of neighbors of all the nodes of cluster C. How many neighbors one node has plus how many neighbors the other node has, until basically you go around all the nodes of the same color, C. So this is how you can build this, but I didn't tell you where it comes from. So let me spend some time on that. So to tell you where, what's the intuition behind this measure is. It's actually very simple. Everything starts from something which is kind of an axiom, a hidden axiom in what is an ill-defined problem. So, oh, is there a question or something?
No, again, keep going.
Okay, all right, sure. This axiom somehow something that most people would believe it is the fact that random graphs or random networks do not have communities. But what is a random graph? Think about it, and I show you a picture here on the right. The prototypical random graph was proposed many years ago, almost a century ago, like in the 50s, in fact, 70 years ago, by two actual Hungarian mathematicians. They are the Shreni model, and you see here a configuration of this on the right-hand side. And basically, according to this model, two nodes have the same probability. Any two nodes have the same probability of being connected. So basically, you go over all possible pairs of nodes, and then you throw basically a number between 0 and 1. If the number is lower than the probability, then you set a node, an edge between those two nodes. Otherwise, you leave the two nodes disconnected, and you loop over all the pairs of nodes, and that's how you construct, for instance, a diagram like this. So by construction, basically, I'm saying that every two nodes have the same probability of being connected or disconnected. Therefore, that means basically that you cannot really expect to find groups of nodes that are more tightly connected to each other than they are to the other nodes, right? Because the probability of connection is the same. That's the reason why people say, okay, in a graph like this, there are no communities. So that's where it starts. So let me tell you a little bit more about the modularity formula here. I told you already what LC is the number of pairs of nodes which are connected within community C. I didn't tell you what this ratio is. This is squared divided by 4m. This is the expected number of links between nodes of community C on a random graph that has the same number of nodes and the same number of links of the original network, and where each node preserves the number of neighbors it has in the original network. So basically what I do is that I generate a randomization of the network in principle as many as I need, the whole ensemble of possible randomizations, by pretty much reattaching the edges of the network. So the nodes are the same, the edges are just reattached, mostly not exactly like this, because they fluctuate a little bit. It's more the equivalent to the canonical ensemble in statistical mechanics, in which the energy is not conserved, but of course is strongly peaked around the value. But for the sake of the argument, let's assume that basically just moving around the edges, but making sure that each node has the same number of neighbors before and after transformation. What you want to do, you want to compare the network that you're studying with a random version of the network, which preserves some of its structural features, specifically the fact that each node has the same number of neighbors, but in which order is basically destroyed. So it's maximally entropic with respect to everything else. The only thing you're preserving is the degree of each node, just because to keep it similar as possible to the original network, but everything else is basically destroyed by noise. And you're comparing the original network with this randomized version of it. Of course, you can have multiple, a huge number of randomization which are possible. You're comparing it with the ensemble. And then you're wondering, after I do the transformation, how many links are connecting nodes of cluster C to each other? This is exactly this ratio here. And I'm going to show you how you get to that. And the idea is that if after I do this randomization, after basically I destroy the communities, because random networks have no communities, LC, the number of links that I actually see connecting blue to blue in my original network, say, and the number of links, expect the number of links that I would have connecting blue to blue if the network were random, but preserving the degrees of the nodes. If there is a difference between these two, specifically if LC is bigger than this expected value, then this community of blue nodes, if you want, is a real community. I mean, it's different from the one I would find in a random graph. The same group of nodes in a random graph, which would not qualify as a community. The larger this difference, the more modular the network would be. And of course, especially when you sum over all the clusters. But we can just focus on cluster by cluster, because this is a sum. It's an extensive measure, which is additive in that it can be expressed as a sum over the cluster. So basically, you can just focus the argument on each single cluster, and the same thing holds for all the others, obviously. So basically, what I'm doing is just comparing what's inside somehow the blue group, what would fall inside the blue groups in terms of links connecting blue to blue if the network were randomized. If the first number is considerably larger than the second one, then it means that there is a suspiciously high density of links connecting blue to blue in my original network than there would be in the randomization. And therefore, the larger the difference, the more modular the network is. So the larger the value of Q, the more modular the network would be, and the more somehow significant the partition would be with respect to modularity. So that's where it comes from. So the last piece is where this ratio comes from. Why this ratio represents exactly this expected number of edges or links. Let me tell you where it comes from. So this is my network. I'm just focusing on one group of nodes. I see somebody put something in the chat. I think it's a good moment, because this is probably the only tricky thing I'm going to tell you. And also it's probably the most important thing I'm going to tell you. So if there is a question, Shuba, please.
Yeah, it says, would LC less than DC squared over 4M mean that you have a more homogeneous network than a random one? And does this exist in real world networks?
Oh, yeah, of course. Actually, that's a great question. Yes, of course. I mean, it can happen. Modularity can also be negative. It cannot be smaller than -1/2. You can show that that's the limit, and it cannot be larger than 1. That's the other limit. That's the upper limit. Yes, it can happen that LC is smaller. That means basically that you would have between some, say, the blue nodes, like in this case, you would have less links than you would find in a random graph. But that means that in this case, since the number of the energy is conserved, if you want, the number of edges is conserved, then you would have more links connecting groups than expected. And that's when that happens, then what you say that these are so-called anti-communities or disassortative communities. What I'm referring to, and it's the main formulation of the problem, I'm referring to the so-called assortative communities in which you have a lot of links inside and not so many between them. Whereas that scenario that has been suggested by the listener here is just the opposite scenario, in which you have then less links than you would expect by random, just by noise. And in this case, they're called disassortative communities. Yes, there are links. Actually, in the extreme case, you may have zero links connecting, for instance, the blue nodes to each other. You may have no links at all connect. This would be the case of extreme disassortativity. And if all the classes are like this would give you what is called a multipartite network, in which there are nodes of different colors with links only connecting nodes of different colors and no links connecting nodes of the same color. So thanks for this question, because I think it helps clarify things. Yes, but this is a scenario which is open. It happens. And actually, it's interesting on its own term and on its own right, and it's definitely studied. Not as much as the case of assortative classes, which is the one which is also more applications, but it's definitely there. Thanks for the question. So let me tell you where this term comes from, how we can then easily phrase it. I mean, in what looks like a complicated ensemble or random network. So basically what I'm doing is, suppose that I'm focusing then on the blue nodes. So on the cluster represent the group of nodes or subset of the graph, which is a blue node, represented by the blue nodes. I break each link in two parts, and each link then generates two stubs. So I had to connect the stub, for instance, to join this blue node to this blue node, but also this. I had to connect these two stubs to connect this blue node to this gray node, which is outside of this group. So blue nodes are the nodes of the group, and the gray nodes represent their neighbors in the initial configuration in my original network. So what I do, I break these stubs, I break these links, I obtain two stubs for each link. And then what I do, I just close my eyes, take a pair of stubs chosen at random and connect it to each other. This is how I randomize the network. Because by doing that, I'm sure that, for instance, this node, who has three neighbors in the original network, will still have three neighbors, because I connected these three stubs to three randomly selected stubs around. So I'm not changing this. So at the end of the day, when I finish my randomization, when all pairs of stubs have been matched randomly, coupled, and then joined and forming edges, then what I obtain is a random network, which is, of course, the same nodes as the original graph, the same links, and also in which each node has preserved this degree, its number of neighbors. And just like before, that's the easiest way to do it. But that's also the basic of the argument that takes me to the expression of that thing. So to form, what I'm interested in is the expected number of links connecting blue to blue. So I had to form an edge connecting a blue node to a blue node. To do that, I have to close my eyes and select two blue stubs, two stubs attached to blue nodes, and connect them to each other. The probability of selecting one stub attached to a blue node is exactly the ratio of the total degree of the nodes in cluster, or the blue nodes, divided by the twice the number of edges. That's because if I have m edges, I have 2m stubs. So the total number of stubs is 2m. And I have to select only the ones which are attached to blue nodes, which is exactly this C, because this C is the total number of neighbors of the blue nodes, which is exactly the number of stubs attached to each node, sum over all the nodes. So if I have this C available, and I have to select one of them, and 2m in total, the probability of selecting one of them at random is this C divided by 2m. Now, to form an edge, of course, I need two stubs, so I need to pick another one. Approximately, not exactly. The probability of picking another one is, again, this C divided by 2m. Not exactly, because you already picked one, so there should be this C minus 1 available out of 2m minus 1, which are still available. That would be the exact count, but in most networks, this C and 2m are much bigger than 1, so you can safely neglect this correction. And therefore, the probability of picking also the second stub connected to blue is this C divided by 2m approximately. So what you have to do, since these are kind of independent events, you have to multiply these two probabilities to tell you what is the probability that the two stubs that I picked are both attached to blue nodes, and therefore they're going to form an edge connecting the two blue nodes. So this is the probability, basically, that an edge of my randomized network connects blue to blue. Since my randomized network has m edges in total, because that number hasn't changed, I'm just reshuffling, repositioning edges, but I'm not changing the number of edges, which is conserved, then the the expected number of edges connecting blue to blue would be then DC squared divided by 4m, which is exactly the term that you see in modularity's formula. So that's probably a good point to ask you whether this is clear, because this is exactly how this formula, where this formula comes from. I mean, this is the easy way to go to this. There are more elaborate ways, but this is the shortcut that I'm using for you today. So otherwise I can just continue, I suppose. So this is where it comes from. So this is the expected number of links connecting, in this case, blue to blue, if the edges are reattached at random, but such that each node preserves the number of neighbors after the randomization. All right, so that's where the formula comes from. So the larger the difference between these two terms, the more non-random that division will be, and it can be assorted if this difference is positive, it can be disassorted if the difference is negative. But when you maximize modularity, of course, you try to go to find a partition that maximizes somehow this gap between the actual number of links connecting nodes of the same color and the expected number of links connecting nodes of the same color. That's all you do. And to give you a sense of this, I have an example for you here. I have this network, which has a seemingly clear modular structure, community structure in two groups indicated by the colors. And when I do my randomization, I do the same exercise. I break the links in two parts, and then I reattach pairwise these stubs totally at random. And this could be an outcome of this process. As you see, after I'm doing this, you see how many more links are connecting than this blue to red with respect to the original one. Originally, there were not so many. Now there are many, because that's also the more likely option. And the surviving, the links which are connecting nodes of the same color, as you see, they're fewer, quite a bit fewer than the ones that you had at the beginning. I indicate them with these blue lines here, both for the blue nodes and for the red nodes. So you see why randomization somehow destroys the community structure. This would be a case in which the gap between the number of edges connecting the blue nodes and the expected value, which would be represented by the average of these blue lines here over all the randomizations that are possible, would be large, and this would end up being a highly modular division of the original graph. All right, so this is basically just general thing, introduction to the topic and to the measure. My first sizable contribution to this topic was when I realized that there was an issue with this measure. This is the same measure, just rephrased. I just emphasized the fact that there is put the square out of this expression here, but it's exactly the same formula. Just to emphasize that in a sense, it looks like DC is divided by this scale, square root of m. It is like square root of m is like fundamental measurement unit of DC. And this is called the modularity scale. And the problem of having this scale specifically present inside the formula, the consequence of this is that clusters smaller than this scale cannot be resolved. So if you have a group of nodes which has square root of m or less total degree, which means the sum of the number of neighbors of the nodes of that group is smaller or equal than square root of m, then something is going to happen to that group of nodes. And to tell you what can happen in practice, let me focus on this example here. This is a network in which, very symmetric, as you can see, in which you seem to have a very clear, very visible community structure represented by the so-called complete graphs or cliques. These subgraphs here with 5 nodes, which are all identical, which are fully connected to each other. There are not missing links between any two blue nodes here. And they are very weakly connected to their neighbors by these individual links here. So you would expect that in this case, any method, including modularity maximization, would just identify the cliques as separate communities. But because of this problem, it's not the case, because if, again, these cliques have total degree, which is less than square root of m, m is being the total number of edges, then modularity will pick for combinations, for groups of nodes which include combinations of these blocks. So it would not resolve the individual blocks. So we'll give you some sort of counterintuitive solution. But this is somehow, if you want, an academic exercise that we put in that paper back in 2007. The actual consequence for people using modularity maximization today, and there are millions of them, perhaps not millions, but thousands for sure, is the fact that if you have a network that you've never seen before, and this is the partition with the largest modularity value, all the pieces, all the cluster, for all the clusters whose total degree is smaller than square root of m, you will not be able to tell a priori if they are proper cluster, like cohesive group of nodes, like in this picture, or if they are, oh, sorry, I missed the other one, or if they are combination of modules like the ones that you see before, or whether there is then structure inside them. It would be impossible to say. It's basically like a microscope, right, in which you have resolution that does not allow you to see some of the details of the object you are watching. So this is basically the consequence, and after that has been a flurry investigation to see how it's possible to avoid it. And one thing that people did right away, just introducing a parameter here just before with this thing, which is called a null model term, coming from this random null model, so that you can tune the importance of the square root of m. And by varying this parameter, you can have classes which are arbitrarily small, arbitrarily large. The problem in that case is that since you have a free parameter, which you wouldn't have in the standard expression of modularity, because there are no free parameters here, then of course the next question would be, how do you settle, how do you find what is the lambda that gives you, the lambda gamma, whatever it's called, a parameter that gives you the right resolution for the system at study, which of course changes case by case, but this is another problem. So this is the first contribution, finding that there is a fundamental limit. More recently, I was on the one hand pleased, on the other hand worried to find out through papers written by other people that this problem is common to pretty much all popular methods of community detection. So all of them have a resolution scale. In most cases, this is exactly square root of m. And it's not obvious why this is the case, because in many cases, you're putting together methods which have very different rationale, very different principles. But it seems to be some sort of like a universal feature of this method. So which means that basically to go deeper, you have to do something else than just applying the method. You will have to either to introduce a resolution parameter or to people are doing some sort of recursive investigation in which you find the first partition and then you look into each piece by reapplying the same method only to that piece to resolve the smaller blocks. This is a method that actually we suggested first in this paper. At that time, we were some young and inexperienced, but people are still doing it today. The only problem would be that if you do this recursively with modularity, then you wouldn't know when to stop, because modularity will keep breaking your system into smaller pieces. And in this case, then it would be necessary to have a stopping criterion, which is again like the same or having a parameter. So this is where we are with this. But like I said, this is still the most popular, by and large, method to find classes in graph, and not only proposed by physicists, widely used by physicists, but universally used by everybody, biologists, engineers, sociologists, everybody. Despite the fact that people are aware of this problem, they found their ways to go around it, and sometimes they just ignore it. Okay, so that was the first thing. The second thing is how to test clustering algorithm. So basically, how can you tell whether method A is better than method B? It's an ill-defined problem. What you do, of course, is that you have some sort of ground truth that people believe in more often than not. So basically, you apply your method on a benchmark graph whose partition is more or less known, and then you expect to see, you try to see how close the division found by the method is to the planted partition of the benchmark graph. By and large, the most used class of network models, which have this hidden community structure, goes under the name of stochastic block model. It's been introduced many years ago in statistics and then social network analysis, and now it's become kind of mainstream also in physics and computer science. Statisticians are still working a lot about this, also trying to find exact results about inference of these models, because these models have been used to as key ingredient of new methods to infer the partition of a network in communities. But I'm not going to talk about this. Let me tell you what the ingredients of these models are. You assign a color to the nodes, and usually you divide the network in groups of equal sides, and you assign probabilities to connect nodes based on their colors. So in which, for instance, the probability of a red node to be connected to a blue node is the same regardless of which particular red node you take and which particular blue node you take. So the probability, the connection probability depends only on the color, basically on the membership of the nodes. This is an example that you see here. In this matrix here, I indicate the values of the probabilities. I don't show the values, I just show them, I just give you a sense of their magnitude based on the size of the blocks that you see here. Diagonal blocks indicate the probability of connecting nodes of the same color. Off-diagonal blocks represent the probability of connecting nodes of different colors. In this case, we have 6 colors, 6 by 6 matrix, which is called stochastic block matrix, and this is a specific realization that is obtained out of this. So you see in the diagonal, actually, there are the 3 big things here, which correspond to red, yellow, and orange here, showing that there is a high probability of yellow and yellow to be connected, and pairs of red nodes to be connected, and pairs of orange nodes to be connected. And you can see they're very cohesive, very close to each other. And then there are also probabilities, to connect, of course, nodes of different colors. This is in general, but the most adopted version of this model, it's a simplification of this model used for testing, is the so-called planted L partition model, which is a simplified version in which there are only 2 probability values. Instead of having a full matrix like you've seen before, the probability that 2 nodes of the same color are connected, and the probability Q that 2 nodes of different colors are connected, regardless of which these 2 colors are. So like in this case, you see that the black nodes, which is inside somehow this group here, is a probability P of being connected to nodes of the same group, and a probability Q of being connected to nodes in different groups, and that goes for all the nodes. And the idea is that, of course, that if P is larger than Q, is the probability of having connections within groups exceeds the probability of having connections between groups, then the groups are communities, and you should be able to find them with a clustering algorithm. The main contribution we gave to this endeavor of testing is the fact that a refinement of this benchmark graph models by recognizing some of the limits of this model, the fact that the groups have the same size, which is not realistic, and the fact that all the nodes have the same number of neighbors on average, which is also not realistic. And you probably remember in the examples of networks I gave at the beginning, there were some nodes which have many more connections than others. They're called the so-called hubs, whether they were hub airports, that you're probably more familiar with the term, what could be hub proteins, which have many more interaction partners than other proteins and other things. So what we did with the so-called LFR benchmark proposed in 2008, and now available even on Network X, and not by us, was a gift that they introduced also our model in their library algorithm. What we do, we introduce these 2 elements of heterogeneity to make the resulting graph more realistic. So we introduce a power law distribution of community sizes that, as you can see here in the specific realization, the clusters at different sizes. There are some with just a handful of nodes, and others that have a couple of dozens of nodes. And the nodes have power law distributions of degree. And the degree is represented here can be visualized by the size of the nodes. You can see that some of them are very small, others are quite large, indicating they have many more neighbors than others. So this is now basically the standard, that most people are using this more realistic benchmark now to test, to see how good their algorithm is. And actually, right after we proposed this, we applied to all the algorithms which were around at that time. We selected specifically 12 of them based on how easy it was to code the algorithm ourselves, or whether the developers were willing to give us their code. We're talking about, end of 2000, which means that at that time, people, perhaps were not really willing to share the code, or did not think that it was valuable. Instead, it's very, very valuable, and we always publish all the codes that we have. Of course, the code for our benchmark is available, and people have been using it extensively. And in this case, we put together this list of methods which have different origins, different classes of methods. And in this comparative analysis, in each of these diagram, or this 12 diagram, represents a performance plot. And the performance is usually represented by the similarity of the partition that the method finds with respect to the partition that is planted in the network that you're using. And on the x-axis, what you have is a parameter which is called a mixing parameter that tells you how separated the clusters are, how many links basically they share with each other. Low values of mu means basically that they are very separated, they're almost disconnected, which means they're very easy to find. Larger values of mu closer to 1 means that they're instead very, very strongly connected, very mixed, and at some point they're so mixed that they're basically undetectable. And therefore you expect, of course, the performance to go down as you increase mu-t, and to be pretty much perfect when mu-t is very small. And that's pretty much the trend you observe in all the cases. And our winners at that time were the two methods that most people are still using today, especially the Leuven algorithm, which has been exploding and is now by far the most used technique in this business. At the same time, I put an asterisk here to emphasize that we didn't clarify one aspect of our application of the Leuven method, and if you had done that, perhaps not so many people would be using it today. Basically, the Leuven method optimizes modularity, and now you know what modularity is, but it does it in a kind of iterative fashion, in a hierarchical fashion. And what we did here, we just use the value that the partition found at the first level of this hierarchy, whereas the highest modularity partition, which is actually should be the outcome of the algorithm, should come on top of this hierarchy. If we had used instead that partition, and perhaps we should have made it clear in the paper back then the performance of the Leuven algorithm, which is indicated here in this top left diagram, would not have been as good as it looks now. But people hopefully now are aware of this, but they're still using it all the same. It's kind of difficult to change a habit after so many years, but we're trying hard, to at least make them aware of the limitations. Well, another thing that we did, to compare is a test which was kind of unique. Since random graphs have no clusters, then if you apply a method, you're supposed to find some trivial division if the method is good. So what we did, we applied, in this case, 10, because for two others, it would have taken too long to run them. So we would never finish the paper. So we only used 10 of them, the faster 10. And we found basically how many classes are found. We plotted how many classes are found as a function of the average degree, the average number of connections per node of two classes of random graphs. And what in this case, what you find is that even the best performing methods, they find indeed the trivial division in one cluster after a while, but when the network is sparse, which means that there are not so many connections around, then they find non-trivial division, which would be kind of meaningless because, like I said, random graphs have no clusters. This is an aspect that I'm very sensitive to when somebody proposes a new method. Say, can you find also some negative results, meaning basically, that some false positives, if you want. So that you find also classes where there are no clusters, because if you do, then there is an issue. How do I know then whether the result of an analysis on a network are reliable or not if I find a non-trivial result also when I'm not expected to find the result? So this is something to keep in mind. And the last thing I want to say here is again at the interface between artificial intelligence and network science. I don't know how familiar you are with this, with word embeddings. It's kind of game-changing thing. It's less than 10 years old in this preprint. It was the Mikolov et al., I think at the time working with Google. With this paper, which is super cited now, basically they show how we can effectively represent words in vector spaces, high-dimensional vector spaces, usually 100 or more dimensions. And you do that by seeing how similar words are to each other based on some bunch of text that you put into your training routine. Like for instance, in this case, you have a source text and you see that some words are close to each other. They are in the same context. And you check basically how frequently, for instance, in this case, the words quick, brown, and fox, jumps, and so on are together based on, of course, of these millions of sentences and paragraphs. And this way you can establish a pairwise similarity between nodes based on the context associated to these nodes in this text. And based on these similarities, you can then project these words in space, in which basically similar words are going to be mapped onto points which are close to each other in these high-dimensional spaces. I tell you that because right after this, people started to embed the graphs in high-dimensional vector spaces. A graph is an infinite-dimensional object. So, I mean, an infinite is a number that physicists like a lot, but for practical reasons, it's good somehow to reduce the complexity of these objects, and therefore, by doing a graph embedding, by embedding a graph, basically you just turn your graph into a continuous distribution of points in a high-dimensional space. And also in that case, just like for words, you project vertices which are close to each other, similar to each other, onto points which are nearby in space, near to each other, next to each other in space. This is a survey for people who are interested. These embeddings have shown to be incredibly powerful at solving some problems like link prediction, the prediction of links which are not there, because, for instance, there is some noise in your data set, and you cannot see some links which are there, so they appear as false as negatives, as true negatives, but they're actually false negatives. In a sense, there should be a connection. You see, what is the most likely link which I missed in my data collection? This is a problem called link prediction, and these graph embeddings have shown to be very powerful at solving this problem, better than existing state-of-the-art approaches at that time. And node classification is also another big, basically assigning attributes to nodes based on existing attributes of other nodes. It's a similar thing. I wanted just to mention node2vec as a spin-off of word2vec, which is a thing that I showed you before, in which before for word2vec, you have nodes, you have words in a context. So basically you have all these groups of nodes connected by the fact that they are parts of a sentence. In node2vec, instead, you have nodes, sequences of nodes, which are discovered by performing random walks on your network. Like for instance, in this case, you have different walks. And by doing that, you see that if two nodes occur frequently in the same walk, that means that they are somehow nearby in the network. And based on this, again, you extract the similarity between pairwise similarity between nodes, and this gives you a way to project these nodes onto points in space, which are then appearing next to each other. This is actually kind of a landmark paper. A lot of people are using node2vec today. We use in our investigation, we specifically asked this question: can we use embeddings to find communities in networks? For instance, if you take this network here, which has this division in 4 groups, which comes from the history of this network, it's not necessarily topological. And you see, this is the projection that you get. Actually, this is a cross-section in 2 dimensions. The projection will have, of course, to be in a higher number of dimensions. You see that indeed nodes in the same color appear close to each other. So there is something to it, and people are starting to ask themselves whether embeddings can offer an alternative ways to break the system into modules. And that's exactly what we ask ourselves because of our expertise in this topic. And last year we put out a paper about this, and we are about to submit actually a longer paper with more details and some interesting conclusion. And basically the conclusion is that these embeddings can offer indeed a very actually quite fast and very precise way of recovering the clusters, at least in toy models, of course, in the case in which you know where the clusters are. And the clustering by embedding is a 2-step procedure. You first embed the graph, you get a bunch of points, and then once you have points in space, there are some techniques which are called data clustering techniques, which tell you which points, groups of points are closer to each other than average. One of these techniques, probably the most famous one, is called K-means clustering. Can tell you what it is about if you're interested after that. And there are still problems attached to this procedure. The fact that, for instance, the number of clusters Q needs to be provided as input. There is no way, direct way to infer it based on the ingredients that you're putting in the procedure. So you have to provide a criterion. And actually, the data clustering step is typically slow, but there are ways to make it faster. And that's actually what we're trying to do now. That said, we were interested just in the performance. So is it possible really to break a network into clusters by doing this 2-step approach, by using embeddings? And the answer is yes. These are similar performance plots like the one you've seen before, with this mixing parameter on the x-axis and the similarity measure between the planted partition and the detected partition on the y-axis. And the red line represents the results of the node2vec embedding and clustering procedure. And the different plots correspond to different average degrees, to different levels of sparsity in your network. And you see that the red line is always on top of ahead of all the other ones, which was pretty surprising, both on the classic SBM with the equal size communities and on our benchmark, where instead communities are very different sizes. Okay, that's it. I hope that I conveyed this message to you. The community detection is a powerful way to analyze networks. That's why so many people are still working on that, even though most people working on networks are users and not developers like myself. And that global optimization techniques have resolution biases, not just modularity maximization, but also a bunch of other techniques have that. So we have to go around this limit somehow, increase the resolution some other way. And then you have to be very careful about validation. This is an ill-defined problem, but of course we need still to be able to tell whether which algorithms are more reliable than others. And finally, embedding and clustering seems to be promising. There is an issue about speed of the actual detection part, because the embeddings by themselves are actually super fast. So the projection can be done very, very quickly in linear time, whereas instead the clustering procedure can be quadratic, and we are working to make it faster. That said, for those who are interested in this topic, I can point them to my survey back in 2010, which is actually one of the best known, most cited papers in network science, and the second most cited paper ever in physics report, with good chances of getting the first spot in a few years. And the more recent version, I mean, I just after that was 12 years ago. Then a few years ago, I just had a lighter version with more updates on the topic. And finally, if you're interested in the topic in general, starting really from scratch, this is probably, like I say, even too simple for people with your background. But this is this book that we published a couple of years ago, having undergraduate students in mind, with Cambridge University Press. And with that, I can take any questions you may still have.
Thank you, Santo.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the book. I meant to mention it in my intro. There is a question from Per. Per, do you want to, which was, if you're here, would you want to ask yourself?
Sure.
Yes, I wanted if you could elaborate on how to choose the number of groups. I mean, we did some of that with the Florida power networks many years ago, but it's
oh, I see.
It's really not trivial. Then
Yeah.
we started small and built up until we maximized the criterion, but I don't know.
Yeah,
Is
actually,
there
that's
anything more general to say.
Yeah, that's a big question. It can take some time, to explore various facets of it. Well, I mean, I told you about modularity maximization. If you somehow close your eyes to the resolution limit, there are no parameters there. In that case, you just get the division into a number of clusters that you don't need to put by hand. A lot of other techniques like InfoMap that I said before, also it has no parameters. It just finds the number of clusters by itself. More recent inference techniques like this SBM inference or SBM that assume that your network is actually an SBM in disguise, a stochastic block model in disguise, and they infer the partition on which the network is based. They initially had this issue because usually many of them rely on maximum likelihood estimation to find the best partition. But the maximum likelihood has the problem that if you don't indicate the number of classes, then it trivially gives you the division in the largest possible number of groups because of maximum entropy. So in that case, you have to do it. But more recent techniques, I would say, even in the last 5 years, also have addressed that, and they propose different criterion, like Bayesian criterion, criteria that can give you this information beforehand, and then you can put it in your system. One thing that you're doing recently in your procedure pipeline, one thing that sometimes we do, like quick and dirty way, is to look at the so-called eigengap. You take the Laplacian matrix of your graph, and you take the eigenvector, the eigenvalues, and which are easy to compute, especially, I mean, not all of them eventually, but just take the ones with the lowest value. The lowest eigenvalue of a Laplacian is 0. Then all the others are positive, and then you just plot them next to each other, and then you see if there are some gaps between consecutive eigenvalues. You take the largest gap. That sometimes gives you a good indication of the ballpark, if not exactly the number you're looking for. We're using this, for instance, for another technique. This has been around also for some time. I hope that I suggested. So basically, the short version is that if you use modularity maximization, InfoMap, and some of the more refined inference techniques, you don't have this problem that the number of clusters somehow is part of the deliverable. In cases like, for instance, in our case here, embedding and clustering, but also the older or maximum likelihood based inference techniques, then you can use one this like a Kaike information method or the BIC or if you want to do something quick and dirty, you can use the eigengap. But it is a big question. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Saki, you have a question? Please ask. Saki, there is someone with a hand raised. Please go ahead and ask your question. No? They've lowered their hand? Or... Yes?
Maybe not. It doesn't look like this person had a question.
Other questions?
Actually, I had a question, but it's on a different topic. So if people still have questions on the community detection, they can go first. But otherwise, I was just curious, or maybe Xin-Chen.
Xining, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, so like, let's say we take the Louvain community detection and there is this kind of resolution parameter. How taboo would it be if the resolution parameter is high enough where there's, let's say, too many communities? And let's say if I'm working with a biological network, I know I should have, let's say, within 20 communities, but it ended up having 50. How taboo would it be to have merged them back together based on some known criteria?
Yeah, I'm happy asking this because we are currently working exactly on that. I got this specific problem, task, or question from people, actually many of them working in biology, like biological system. I say, I mean, I have more or less an idea of how many classes I want to find or how large they are. You know, if a method finds classes which are smaller than that, I don't trust it. If it finds classes which are larger than that, I don't trust it. So, but at the same time, I need a method to do my partition. So how do I do that? So one thing that we are exploring right now is to introduce these constraints at the level of the optimization. So if suppose that you have a range and I say, I mean, I want my classes to be, I don't know, with at least 10 nodes and no more than 50. You can, of course, constrain your optimization to see which partition would have would satisfy this, right? Which is the best partition satisfying this criterion. We're trying to implement this thing in a competing method to Louvain, which is called Leiden, which is still which is in the Netherlands, not so far from Louvain, by the way, which is in Belgium, and which is basically a way that it's basically Louvain in disguise, because that's basically pretty much what you say based on modularity maximization like Louvain. It does it hierarchically like Louvain. It has some small minor differences that somehow avoid some problems to the original Louvain procedure. And this is a one-shot thing. If you don't introduce a resolution parameter, then you have to be lucky to find the number of classes you want to find or the size of the class you want to find. We want to make it a bit more flexible somehow with some sort of input from the domain experts that says, I don't know, I don't want classes larger than that. I don't want classes smaller than that. I don't want more than 20 clusters. And so that they can accommodate these constraints. So basically the answer will be constrained optimization. Because what you're suggesting, basically, okay, I get a partition, and then of course I try instead to combine the pieces. You can still do that, I mean, but of course, also in that case, you don't really have many guarantees how good this partition is in general, because obviously you're losing quality the moment you are, and specifically you're lowering the value of modularity if you do this combination more often than not. So the only way to do it perhaps is to do it in a way that decreases the number of the value modularity as little as possible, that it can somehow still keeps you at a high level. But like I said, we're working on that. So this is a very good question because, and feel free to check up with me, like in a couple of months, we may have some news for you.
Janko, there's a question. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I was the Saki. I connected through the phone, didn't let me speak. So here I am. Thanks for the great talk. I just had a quick question / scenario. What if the graph that you are given from the data happen to be capturing spurious connection, not making the right connection? So it's a wrong graph to begin with, to learn the community from. And in the specific case I'm thinking of is I work with the single cell sequencing data from which we need to find the cluster, visualize in 2 dimensions, whatnot. But there we are not given the graph. So we find the graph or compute the graph with k nearest neighbor using Euclidean metric. So that's a big steep ask for this high dimensional data. So there's no indication that KNN graph is the right graph. But on that graph, we apply Leiden or Louvain and then use some spring-directed embedding to visualize it. But we always wonder whether that's the right procedure or we just took a wrong turn from the beginning by using that KNN. So for you, do you ever run into this graph? Like, is it the right graph issue?
Yes, I mean, not directly. I have always been curious about this problem. So the short answer is the modularity maximization, and I would say some of the mainstream methods have no way to assess this because they really are just to assume basically that the input is correct. But luckily, in the last few years, I would say probably specifically in the last 5 years, there's been some work within the context of statistical inference, specifically Bayesian inference, most notably this SBM inference techniques, inference of stochastic block models, so specifically for clusters with graphs, for graphs with clusters or communities that address this problem. What happens if you have a noisy data set? So today, the only thing that I mentioned in this regard is kind of the opposite problem, in the sense that, I mean, it's still noise, of course. I mean, it's about the link prediction thing, right? I just quickly mentioned it, that in some cases you say, okay, you acknowledge that your network is not perfect, so that there are some links that are probably there, but you don't see them. So what would be then the more likely links that you should add to your network based on the structure to make more sense with respect to the rest of the structure? And there are, of course, like I said, this problem is a long literature. But in this case, I think, and of course, the thing can be applied also in reverse, which links we have to remove, would have to be removed to make somehow the structure more pure and therefore also more believable. So it's basically an inverse link prediction problem. So there are, of course, a lot of techniques about this, and some of them basically also address this issue of finding the cluster structure, community structure, and network of a noisy network, basically by removing or assigning a probability to these links which are either there and they shouldn't be there, or vice versa. So I can point you to a couple of papers. So if you reach out to me, I'm not sure what's your name. I think my email is available somewhere. Yeah. I'd be happy to send you papers on this, which I think come with code. So you wouldn't have to do it yourself. I mean, I think there are going to be links to GitHub repositories where this code is stored, and you can at least try it on your data and see if you're happy with what you get.
Thank you. That'd be great. Yeah,
sure. This is a great question, because especially in biology, there's a lot of noise. Right? I acknowledge that. Yeah. Yes, and we have to address that. But like I said, this classic method, I mean, modularity has been like almost 20 years old. We were so at that time, I mean, even quadratic complexity looked like a holy grail. And now instead, it's rubbish. I mean, people go for linear complexity. Many things have changed. And one of the things, of course, is acknowledging the limits of the inputs. And in the last few years, people have acknowledged that and addressed that. Yeah, so there are some solutions that I can share with you. I never worked on this myself, but I know that there are solutions.
Xining, did you have a quick follow-up or a new question?
Yeah, I have a new question, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
And then we'll have John ask his question.
Okay. So with for example, Louvain and quite a few other of these community detection, seems like they're like non-deterministic algorithms. So even if I run the algorithm on the same graph, like identical graph, it can return a slightly different partition. So if I have two different graphs and I expect, let's say, some biological change due to some biological nature of the graph, but I'm applying this community detection on it, and the algorithm itself has this uncertainty every time I run it. How do I kind of estimate the uncertainty of the partition or the change? How do I know if the change in the community structure between the two graphs is due to a biological standpoint versus the algorithm just happens to?
Yeah, this is a good question. I will collect it. I mean, this is probably my record, really average quality of question is very high today. I mean, of course, it also depends on the fact that some of you apparently are working with this, so really have faced these problems. It just so happens that I'm the person that first addressed this problem. In 2012, we published a paper called Consensus Clustering in complex networks. It's actually widely cited and widely used, acknowledging this. I mean, not the people didn't know about it. And some people were astonished when I ran Louvain many times on the same data set. I can get really widely different partitions. Of course, in principle, you can say that you do have a criterion to establish which partition makes more sense, right? Because you have modularity. So, I mean, at least in the case of Louvain, but also in case of other methods, like for instance, InfoMap that I briefly mentioned. InfoMap is not based on modularity, but it's based on optimizing another quantity, which has to do with information compression. You basically compress the information required to describe a random walk taking place on your graph. That quantity actually has to be minimized and not maximized, but it is its own quality function, which means that in this case, you have what is called a description length. And if you have 10 different partitions found by running InfoMap 10 times on the same data set, then you just pick the one with the lowest description length. And for Luen, it would be the one with the largest modularity. So in principle, there is a way to address that. However, we found in the paper that I mentioned, 2012, and follow-up, that you get more robust divisions if you just combine different partitions. And the way to do that, out of several, is using a so-called co-clustering matrix, which tells you for each two nodes, how many times these two nodes are co-clustered, are appearing in the same cluster in the input divisions that you obtain by running your method multiple times on the same data set. And basically cluster that matrix, cluster that co-cluster matrix. This is a procedure we introduced, and it's been used widely, for instance, network neuroscience, and also in other disciplines. But also more recently, there is a big awareness about the fact that, it's not just the maximum that gives you all the information you need, that there could be noise attached to that, and that you have to use multiple per division to combine somehow, to explore basically the whole landscape, identifying somehow pots of solutions and try to make them as little noisy as possible, as noisy as possible. So this is a problem I'm totally aware of. I also worked extensively on this. I can send you, if you're not aware about this consensus clustering, it's a big thing. And like I said, in the meantime, it's 10 years plus old. But there's also recent works, including by Mark Newman, like 2 years ago, that address this, how to make more sense of the fact of this stochasticity. Because obviously, again, you have a double problem here, right? You have noise coming from the data collection process, and you have noise coming from the stochastic optimization of your quality function. And it would like at least to limit the second source of noise. Like I say, today we are lucky that we have options also for the first source of noise, as I addressed in the previous question. But obviously, yeah, we're not there yet in terms of finding, something which is conclusive about this. But it's work in progress. And like I said, there are already interesting solutions to this. So basically, my short answer would be consensus clustering. And I can give you, I'm happy to share references if you're not aware of this approach. I think they could offer it. And in our case, we also share the code. So you can also, run it on your data set and see if you find something more stable than any solution provided, one-shot solution provided by your favorite algorithm.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I looked into the consensus clustering and I tried a couple algorithms, but it didn't really work very well.
Reach out to me,
Yeah. You can
Thank you.
continue this conversation. John, do you want to ask your question, and then we'll end after that?
Okay, sure. Sorry. I hope this doesn't lead to something too long, but I guess in addition to thinking about communities, you've also have a body of work that's on sort of importance of nodes and citation networks and so forth. And I saw that you had a recent paper where you were proposing an E-index as another.
That's right.
I just wonder if you could say something, a couple words about that.
Oh yeah. First of all, I mean, this is probably the first. I've been working. Yes, exactly. I mean, my activity is two-sided. I'm also a network scientist, and I use also network models and tools and actually specifically clustering for these studies on science of science. I'm also become more and more involved in these investigations, but and proposing indicators is not certainly a priority for me, and it was not a priority for that paper. That was more a study about what is the of elite scientists, most specifically Nobel laureates in all disciplines, physics, medicine, and chemistry, to see basically whether more often than not you have one-hit wonders, like the big discovery, and then not much else. Like, and of course, probably also we're all physicists here, so we have some examples in mind of this class. Or whether instead having a consistent production of knowledge was the more common pattern. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that's the case. That pretty much in most cases, almost all cases, Nobelists produce high quality work throughout their career, sometimes very comparable with in quality. I mean, quality means, again, not quality. Let's say, I don't know, you can call it, I mean, of course, this is citation-based indicator. So there is probably some association with quality and certainly with impact. But of course, it's not a one-to-one correspondence. We're totally aware of this. We put a disclaimer in our portal, the e-index portal, that we did so that you can compute your own statistics there, and also find, which percentile, the different things are. I mean, it's just a game if you want. So the index came late when we realized that it was an index rewarding consistency. Basically, if different people have the same average number of papers, the one who gets the higher H index is the one who has this impact somehow more uniformly distributed across the portfolio, rather than having it concentrated on one or two key papers. So, and eventually we realized that with this metrics, we could actually pretty much find all the Nobel laureates in medicine in the last 5 years, because our data set stopped at 2017. Then we added these new portfolios, people who got the award since then in the last 5 years, including this year, 2022. And we found that they were among the top 20, people out of thousands with the largest E index. So basically, it's a product.
Index.
Excuse me?
Doesn't the H index also have like a kind of,
it trades off, but the point is that, for instance, I mean, there are two things here, and actually, I had a recent discussion with klogW, which is the one who managed the Web of Science just on Monday about this. They're interested in adopting also adding some of the index to their list of indicators. Of course, no indicator replaces any other, but the H index has two big problems. First of all, it can only increase, right? Which means that, I mean, I have an H index of 50, and then after that, I start publishing rubbish. I still have an H index of 50. So whereas instead, your reputation can also go down if you don't do the right moves. Whereas the index can also go down if you start producing low quality, I mean, let's say poorly received work. And then, I mean, for the H index to be high, you really need a lot of papers, because it goes with the number of papers too, right? So if you're at, for instance, the early career stage and you have like 10 papers, your H index can at most be 10. Whereas the index can be very high already at that stage, because you just need a handful of paper to start building a portfolio. The index is basically the product of the average number of citations of all your papers times the entropy of the citation distributions of your paper. So it has a component which has to do with the average impact of your work, and a component which is the entropy, which has to do with the consistency of the distribution of this, how uniform the distribution is. The more uniform, the larger the value of the entropy, and therefore the larger the index. For two people who have the same average. This was a curiosity that came out, but the whole work, I mean, was about, most of the work was about, this thing, just profiling Nobelists based on their, whether they're consistent or the one-hit model was also, and there are, of course, several Nobelists were basically one-hit wonders. You probably have some in your mind, but apparently this is the exception, not the rule. That's where it comes from. I'm happy. I mean, of course, I had to choose a topic for this. I thought the network topic was the more appealing. When I talk about science of science, everybody responds because everybody's involved in that. Everybody's a department chair with computes perhaps metrics.
Right.
Ask for how many papers you have. What is your H index and so on. You can include the things at least we do here for promotion and tenure evaluations, assessments. It's of course a biased practice. There are certain things which are wrong. And we certainly don't claim to have solved any problem by introducing another actor in this scene, but it's more a curiosity. I mean, I'm more interested in things like how the science evolves as a whole. In this case, we're using embeddings a lot now. Projecting papers into points in space and see basically where science is going, seeing how where novelty is seeded, see what which papers are disruptive in that the paradigm, they create new paradigm, all things that can be actually quite successfully being tracked down with analysis that you can do in this high dimensional spaces. This DA index was more like a more exceptional in terms of kind of my type of contribution. Most of my contributions have been like for instance, I discovered a universality law of citation distribution. That's how the thing started back in 2008. That basically distribution of citations of papers in the same field and year is the same across all papers and all disciplines in year if you normalize the number of citations by the average. That's how I got interested, because as a statistical physicist, I like universality, of course. That's what gave me the motivation to look for the signatures also in this type of data set. And then I branched out a little bit. And now we're using also machine learning, deep learning, and specifically graph embeddings to language embeddings to understand science as a system, basically studying as our universe. Yeah. But it's fun. I always have fun talking about it. Thanks for your question, because I wasn't supposed to be part of this conversation. And if you have other questions about the index.net, it's our portal. There is a reference to the paper, and let's see what happens. But it's just just adds a new dimension, because it has certainly feature the H-index does not have, and it complements it somehow. And like I said, again, this is only if you want to use citations, for